The Keth Varan arrived on a Tuesday, which Marek Dvořák always thought was the most forgettable day of the week. Nothing important ever happened on a Tuesday, or so he'd believed. They came in silence, the way all truly terrible things do. Not with the thunder and spectacle that humanity had imagined for a century in paperbacks and cinema screens, as a low-pressure change in the atmosphere, a wrongness that dogs felt first, then children, then old women who'd survived enough history to recognize the shape of it. By Wednesday morning, their ships hung above every major city on Earth, vast and black as bruised storm clouds, and by Thursday afternoon they had transmitted their ultimatum in 47 languages, including 3 that humanity had assumed were dead. The translation was impeccably polite. That was the worst part. Shh. We have studied your species for 112 of your years. The Keth Varan communicated. We find you to be industrious, creative, and remarkably resilient for a single-planet civilization. However, your rate of resource consumption, territorial aggression, and atmospheric destabilization represents a measurable risk to 3 neighboring star systems currently under Keth Varan stewardship. You have 2 options. Surrender administrative governance of your planet to the collective or be reduced. We are prepared to be patient. You have 90 of your days. Be reduced meant no diplomat needed to ask. The Keth Varan had helpfully included an appendix, a catalog of 12 other worlds they had reduced, each one a before and after image pair. The before images showed cities, farmland, coastlines. The after images showed smooth gray plains, perfectly level, perfectly sterile, as if a cosmic iron had pressed all of it flat. Marek Dvořák was not a general, a diplomat, or a scientist. He was a mid-level facilities engineer for a wastewater treatment plant in Ostrava, Czech Republic, and he learned about the alien ultimatum the same way most people did. From his phone, while eating a ham sandwich at his desk, 37 minutes into what had promised to be a very boring Thursday. He read the notification twice. He put down his sandwich. He looked out his office window at the gray November sky and thought, with the particular clarity that only the truly ordinary can muster in extraordinary moments. Well, that complicates things. The 90 days passed the way catastrophic time always does, both glacially and at speed. The first 2 weeks were panic, then a kind of numb administrative fury, as governments convened emergency sessions and military planners dusted off contingencies that had seemed paranoid fantasies 6 months ago. The Keth Varan waited with what felt horribly like patience. Their ships did not move. They did not threaten again. They simply hung there, enormous and still, while below them 8 billion humans argued about what to do. Czech Republic, for reasons of geography, stubbornness, and a national character that had survived the Romans, the Habsburgs, the Nazis, the Soviets, and 40 years of bureaucratic socialism with its ironic soul more or less intact, was among the countries that voted to resist. This surprised no one who had spent time in Czech pubs. Marek didn't vote. He was busy. He had as a chain event so improbable that he never fully reconstructed it later, ended up as part of the small civilian technical team embedded with a military research group in a converted faculty building at Brno University. His expertise was infrastructure. Specifically, his uncanny ability to look at a failing system and identify the exact point at which it was breaking down. He'd spent 15 years optimizing pipe networks, filtration membranes, flow rates. He understood systems. He understood failure. And the Keth Varan, it turned out, had given humanity a system problem. The alien ships and shielding operated on a principle the physicists were calling phase coherence, a continuously cycling energy lattice that adapted, in real time to any directed energy attack, essentially learning the frequency of each weapon and adjusting to become transparent to it within milliseconds. Every missile, every laser, every directed charge humanity had tried in the first 3 weeks of covert resistance had been absorbed, redirected, or simply passed through as though the ship weren't there. The shields didn't block attacks. They metabolized them. It's like trying to hit fog, the team's lead physicist, Dr. Horachkova, said one night over cold coffee. She had the haggard look of someone who had stopped sleeping by choice rather than circumstance. Every time we push, it yields. Every time we pull back, it reasserts. The system has no fixed state to attack. Merrick was staring at the readout from their third failed test, a graph that showed the shield's energy signature adapting in real time to their particle beam. He was thinking about wastewater. "Can I ask you something stupid?" he said. Horachkova had learned, in 3 weeks of working with him, that his stupid questions were rarely stupid. Go ahead. When the shield adapts, it's not adapting to the attack itself. It's adapting to the frequency signature of the attack. Yes? Correct. It reads the incoming energy's characteristics and phase shifts to match. So the attack passes through harmlessly. So it's not defending against force. It's defending against recognizable patterns. Yes. If you hit it with something that doesn't have a consistent pattern. Horachkova stared at him. What do you mean? Merrick turned the readout graph around and pointed to the adaptation curve. I had a problem like this 6 years ago. Ostrava, infiltration line. We had a bacterial film forming in the membrane that was adapting to our chemical treatment cycles. Every disinfectant we ran through, the biofilm learned. Within 3 treatment cycles, it was immune. He tapped the graph. We couldn't kill it because we were too predictable. So we switched to randomized treatment pulses. Not random in terms of whether they'd work, but random in timing and sequencing and combination. The biofilm couldn't adapt fast enough to a pattern that didn't exist. Horachkova was very still. The shield needs something to read, Marek said. Something to recognize. What happens if we give it nothing to recognize? The next 6 days were the most intense of Marek's life, including the 2 weeks in hospital after his appendix ruptured when he was 24. The physics team worked out what they'd need. Not a weapon with a randomized frequency, but a weapon with genuinely stochastic output. Quantum-level unpredictability baked into the emission profile at the hardware level. Not pseudo-random. Genuinely random, which in physics was a considerably harder problem than it sounded. Marek didn't understand most of what they built. He understood the principle. He understood the plumbing, so to speak. The way energy would need to flow from the power source through the modulation array and out through the emitter without any section of path imposing order on the chaos. He spent 4 days crawling through the prototype's internal architecture, which was housed in what had previously been a particle accelerator maintenance tunnel, identifying every point at which the system's own structure was accidentally regularizing the output. There were 11 of them. He fixed all 11. He did it the same way he'd fixed the filtration system in Ostrava, methodically, without drama, eating lunch at his workstation and sleeping 4 hours a night on a folding cot in the corner of the tunnel. He called his mother on the phone each evening and did not tell her what he was doing, which wasn't difficult, because she talked mostly about her neighbor's dog and a television program she was watching. 41st day of the ultimatum, 49 days before the Kethvaron's deadline, they were ready to test. Test itself was anticlimactic in the way that actually correct solutions usually are. They targeted one of the smaller Kethvaron patrol vessels that had taken up a holding position over Brano. The stochastic emitter fired for 0.8 seconds. The patrol vessel's shields registered the attack and attempted to adapt, and then simply failed to do so, because there was nothing stable to adapt to. The energy tore through. The patrol vessel listed hard to port, lost altitude, and crashed into a field outside the town of Schlapanus, destroying approximately 4 hectares of winter wheat and a storage shed. Nobody cheered. They all looked at the screens for a long moment. And then Horachkova started to cry very quietly. And then several other people started to cry. And then Marek made coffee, because that was what you did. Word traveled faster than they could contain it. Within 36 hours, 3 other research teams in 3 other countries had been quietly briefed and were working on their own versions. The military plans came to Brno in cars with military plates and shook hands and used words like game changer and paradigm shift that Marek found mildly irritating. He went back to fixing the emitter's 4th-stage modulation component, which had shown signs of heat stress in the test, and thought about what would need to change in the thermal management system to prevent failure under sustained fire. The Kethvaron noticed this down to the patrol vessel, of course. They noticed it the way a surgeon notices that a patient's hand is twitching during what was supposed to be a routine procedure, with a sudden sharp reassessment of the situation. They transmitted a new message on day 43. Destruction of Kethvaran administrative property is a violation of Provisional Protectorate protocols. We note that the incident appears to involve a directed energy discharge of an unusual type. We strongly advise against further hostile action. The deadline remains. They're worried, Horachkova said, reading the translation. Listen to the language. Strongly advise. They were warning us before. Now they're asking. They don't know if we have more, Marek said. Do we? He thought about the 7 other prototype units that his notes had been distributed to, and the 14 engineering teams now working from those notes. And the fact that every one of those teams had people who were better physicists than he was, even if none of them were better at finding the place where a system was quietly breaking down. We will, he said. The next 23 days were the longest of Marek's life, which was saying something given that the previous 43 had also been fairly significant. The military ran coordinated strikes on days 51, 54, and 58. Each time, a cluster of Kethvaran vessels found themselves suddenly vulnerable in ways their doctrine had never anticipated. The shield adaptation technology, so elegant, so perfect, so unchallengeable against any patterned attack, was simply helpless against chaos. You cannot learn the shape of something that has no shape. The Kethvaran were not stupid. They adapted their tactics. They began flying their ships in complex formation patterns, using the shields of multiple vessels in overlapping configurations to cover each other, blind spots. They began positioning their ships at higher altitudes, beyond the current range of the emitters. They began for the first time to take the resistance seriously. This was, as it turned out, when they became truly dangerous. On the morning of day 63, 6 Kethvaran heavy vessels broke from their holding pattern over Prague and descended to 3,000 meters. They transmitted no warning. They simply began firing. Not their primary weapons, which would have been genuinely catastrophic, but their defensive suppression systems were quite catastrophic enough. Marek was in Brno when it started. He watched it on a laptop screen, sitting in the maintenance tunnel next to the emitter he'd spent the last 2 weeks upgrading, eating a cold sausage from the university canteen. The footage was grainy and shot from a dozen different angles. He watched the streets of Prague fill with a pale violet discharge that moved like water but burned like acid, and he thought about 2 things simultaneously: the 1.3 million people currently in Prague, and the fact that the Kethvaran were doing this not to win, but to demonstrate. To show what the cost of resistance looked like was what the Kethvaran did. He had read the appendix to the original Ultimatum enough times to understand the pattern. They didn't commit to full destruction immediately. They demonstrated it in portions. They showed you what was coming if you persisted, and they waited to see if that would be enough. He understood, in that moment, with the cold clarity of a man who had spent his career reading the behavior of systems under stress, that this was their version of adaptation. They couldn't beat the stochastic emitter, they couldn't learn the weapon. So instead, they were attacking the thing that had built the weapon, the human willingness to keep fighting. They were trying to break the soul of it. Marek sat with this understanding for approximately 4 minutes, watching the Kethvaran maintain their position over Prague with the patient, horrible stillness of things that do not fear consequences, and then he picked up his phone and called his mother. She answered on the second ring. He could hear the television in the background. The news, Bridge of Prague, the anchor's voices carefully controlled and failing to stay that way. Marek, she said, and nothing else. I'm fine, he said. In Brno. Are you all right? I'm watching, she said. It's terrible. A pause. Are you doing something about it? He looked at the emitter. He thought about the 11 points in the system where order had been trying to creep back in. He thought about the biofilm in the Ostrava filtration membrane, how it had only needed 3 treatment cycles to develop immunity to any predictable chemical, and how it had taken exactly 0 cycles to adapt to a treatment with no pattern to learn. Yes, he said. Good, she said. Call me when it's done. He called the team back from their emergency stand-down. He told them what he was thinking. Horachkova listened with her arms folded and her eyes focused on the middle distance, which was her expression for doing mathematics faster than she could verbalize it. You want to use the emitter on the Prague group, she said. not just the emitter. He spread his notes across the table. They're flying in formation to reinforce each other's shields. So we hit all 6 simultaneously, which means we need 6 synchronized emitters. The synchronization itself can't introduce a pattern, because the Cathvaron shields communicate with each other. If there's any regularity in the timing between our shots, the collective adaptation algorithm will find it. Right. So we need 6 genuinely independent stochastic sources firing in uncoordinated simultaneity, which means no trigger signal, no central command. Each unit fires on its own quantum random clock within a window. Horachkova was quiet for a moment. That's either brilliant or it won't work at all. It's both, Marek said. But the alternative is watching them demonstrate Prague for another week and then move to Bratislava. He slept 3 hours that night. He spent the rest of it doing something he'd been doing his whole career, finding the places where the system would fail and fixing them before they could. By 4 in the morning, he had gone through every component of all 6 emitters, which were now being transported into the greater Prague area, under cover of what the military was officially calling a humanitarian logistics operation, and what was actually a desperate bet that the Cathvaron didn't have good enough ground surveillance to notice 6 large vehicles moving toward their attack corridor. The emitters were positioned by dawn, 6 teams in 6 locations, each with one of his modified units and a set of instructions he had written himself, in plain language. Kind of language you used when you needed a maintenance technician to do something correctly under stress, without being able to ask follow-up questions. He was not in Prague, he was in the Brno tunnel, watching feeds from all 6 positions on a bank of monitors they'd assembled overnight. The Prague situation was ongoing. The Cathvaron had paused their suppression discharge sometime in the night, seemingly satisfied with the message they'd sent, and were now holding position again, which was more frightening in its way than if they'd kept firing. Horachkova stood beside him. She had not slept either. She was holding a cup of tea, and she had not drunk from it since she'd made it, and it was certainly cold by now. The window is 60 seconds, he said. Any unit that's ready fires in the next 60 seconds after the signal. No coordination beyond that. And if only 2 or 3 of them fire, if the others have a malfunction. Marek had thought about this. Then we learned something, he said. It was not the most reassuring thing he'd ever said, and Horachkova laughed, which was not entirely a happy sound. The signal went out at 07:02 local time. 4 of the 6 units fired within the window. 2 had equipment failures. 1 a power coupling that he would later discover had a manufacturing defect he hadn't caught, which bothered him for weeks afterward, and 1 a targeting calibration issue that was correctable and was corrected. But too late for this action. 4 was enough. The Cathvaron, formation over Prague, had been flying in a tetrahedron configuration with overlapping shield coverage. 4 simultaneous stochastic strikes, each from a different angle, and each with a completely independent emission profile, hit the formation at 07:44. The collective shield adaptation algorithm, which had been engineered to handle any coherent attack by any known type of directed energy, simply had nothing to work with. It fired in 4 directions at once, trying to find the pattern, and found nothing, because there was no pattern, and in the 340 milliseconds it spent searching, all 4 strikes landed. 2 Cathvaron heavy vessels were destroyed outright. 1 lost all propulsion and drifted west. 1 managed an emergency maneuver that took it up and out of range, where it remained, apparently disabled. The remaining 2, which had been on the formation's outer edges and partially shielded by distance, withdrew. The skies over Prague were clear for the first time in 63 days. Marek watched the feeds from his folding chair in the maintenance tunnel in Brno, and felt something he didn't have a very precise word for. Not triumph exactly, not relief exactly, something that sat between them and was quieter than either. Horachkova finally drank her tea. She made a face because it was cold. The Cathvaron Collective transmitted a new message at noon on day 64. The translation was notable for several reasons, not least because it was the first message they'd sent without a deadline or an ultimatum attached to it. We request a cessation of hostilities and direct communication with human military and scientific leadership. We note that the weapon class, currently being deployed against HFY vessels, represents an approach we did not anticipate in our prior. The assessment of human technological development. We are prepared to reassess our administrative designation of your world. They're asking to talk, Horachkova said. They're asking because they can't win, said Colonel Novacek, the military liaison who had been their connection to the broader coordinated effort since the beginning. He had aged noticeably in 2 months. Not with their current doctrine against our current capability. Their shields can't learn something they can't read, and we can build more emitters faster than they can figure out how to counter them. They're also not stupid, Marek said. He was still looking at the feeds. They'll find a counter, eventually. We just found it first. So what do we do? Marek thought about wastewater. He thought biofilms and adaptation curves, and the long, patient work of keeping a system and functioning under continuous biological pressure. You never really won that fight, not permanently. You just stayed ahead of it. You kept learning, kept changing your approach, refusing to become predictable. We talk, he said, and while we talk, we build more emitters. The negotiations lasted 11 months, which was a different kind of work entirely. And not work that Marek was part of beyond some early technical briefings. He went back to Ostrava in the spring, to the wastewater plant, to the filtration membranes and the maintenance schedules, and the slow bureaucratic pleasures of infrastructure management. His team had kept things running without him, which was, he reflected, how a good system should work, not dependent on any single component. The HFY withdrew their ships in stages over 8 months of negotiation. What they got in return, eventually, was a trade agreement and a mutual defense protocol, and an understanding that humanity was not going to be administered by anyone, under any protocol, provisional or otherwise. What humanity got was first contact, all the complicated knowledge and peril that came with it, and the certain knowledge that there were other species out there. Some of them with better shields, some of them with better weapons, all of them looking at a species that had just demonstrated something the HFY, who had reduced 12 worlds in their long history of expansion, had never seen before. Not the weapon was just engineering. The thing they'd never seen was a species that dealt with the impossible, the same way it dealt with the merely difficult, by going to work. Was there a ceremony in Prague in the autumn of the following year? A large number of people received medals. Marek received one too, which he found faintly embarrassing and stored in the same drawer as his extended service certificate from the Ostrava Municipal Water Authority. Dr. Horachkova received a considerably more significant award, which she absolutely deserved. She had done the harder physics. Marek shook her hand at the reception afterward, and she said, "I want you to know that I think what you did was extraordinary." And he said, "I found some places where a system was breaking down." And she laughed at him in a fond way and went to talk to the Minister of Science. He took the train home the next morning. His mother picked him up at the station in her small red car, the same car she'd had for 9 years, and she drove him home and made tea and told him about her neighbor's dog, which had apparently developed a fear of birds, and the television program, which had been renewed for another series, and asked him whether he'd eaten properly while he was in Prague. He said he had, which was almost true. She said she was glad he was back. He said he was glad to be back. This was, he reflected, looking out the kitchen window at the November sky, clear now, properly clear, the kind of clear that you noticed because it had been absent for so long. Probably the truest thing he'd said in months. The drawer, with the medal in it, also had, tucked in the back corner, a photograph he'd taken on his phone on the morning of day 64, just after the feeds from Prague went clear. It was a terrible photograph, dark and slightly blurred, taken in the maintenance tunnel, with the equipment visible in the background. He was in it, unintentionally, reflected in the dark screen of a monitor, an ordinary-looking man with a coffee cup and 3 days of stubble, looking at something off-camera with an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite anything else. He'd never shown it to anyone. He kept it because it was the one piece of evidence he had that he'd actually been there, in the room, when the thing happened that the historians and the diplomats and the military analysts would spend the next generation trying to explain. He hadn't explained it to any of them, not fully. He'd told them about the biofilm, the filtration system, the 11 points where order was creeping back into the chaos. He'd told them the technical parts. What he hadn't told them, because it didn't fit in a briefing document and because he wasn't entirely sure he had the right words for it, was the thing he'd understood in the maintenance tunnel on day 43, watching Prague on a laptop screen while eating a cold sausage. The Kethvaran had studied humanity for 112 years. They had cataloged the technology, the politics, the military capability, the resource base. They had run their assessments and calculated their margins, and concluded that humanity was manageable, a species with potential, that had not yet developed in ways that made it genuinely difficult. What they had not understood, and what no amount of observation from orbit would have let them understand, was this. When you told a human being that something was impossible, a certain kind of human being went very quiet, the same way water goes quiet when you channel it into a narrow pipe, and all that quietness was just pressure finding its direction. The Kethvaran had seen the aggression, and the chaos and the resource consumption, and they had quite reasonably concluded that these were problems. They had not realized that the things they'd catalogued as problems were, under the right conditions, also solutions. Stubbornness, the flat refusal to recognize an impossible situation as impossible. The willingness to work through the night on a problem that might not be solvable. Eating bad food and calling your mother, right up until the moment it turned out to be solvable after all. The Kethvaran had given humanity 90 days and expected gratitude. What they got was 43. And then they got a wastewater engineer from Ostrava, who had spent 15 years learning exactly where systems failed, applied that knowledge to their most sophisticated technology, and fixed the problem the same way he fixed every problem, methodically, without drama, with the particular stubbornness of a person who had learned, working on infrastructure that nobody thanked him for, and nobody noticed until it stopped working, that the most important things are the ones you keep doing whether anyone is watching or not. He poured the tea. He listened to his mother talk about the dog. Outside the kitchen window, the sky held its cold November color, clear all the way up, clear as far as you could see, he thought. Well, that's that then, and went back to work.